comments or questions, we will revisit them at the end of the program as opposed to interrupting the presentation. So if you have any questions or anything to add, go ahead and write them out before you forget, and I'll be finding those in the chat and sharing them at the end. So just a bit about GBC, the Green Burial Council, before we get started. We're a nonprofit organization with two missions. The first is educational. We offer education to the funeral cemetery industry and also to the general public to help people be more prepared to make their green burial arrangements when they have to do so, and also to help the industry be ready to serve those customers. Which relates to the second mission of GBC, which is we offer a voluntary certification credential and best practices to the cemetery and funeral industry and for biodegradable burial products. Our topic tonight, talking to children about death and green burial, it revolves around principles that are not unique to green burial. Some of us could use these principles regardless of what the funeral type or the environmental implications of what's going on around a person's death. But I find that there's a good overlap between our GBC audience, those of you who are on our Facebook page, who get our newsletters, and want to be here for death positive education tonight. You just may be the person in your community that is in a position to give a word of advice when there is a situation where we have a grieving child. So I want to thank Ilana Haimes. Ilana is a Green Burial Council volunteer. You can support the Green Burial Council by filling out our volunteer form on our website, and also the QR code on this screen goes to our donation form if you should want us to support us that way. I'm going to turn over the presentation to Ilana. She'll take over the screen sharing. And again, any questions go in the chat and I'll come back at the end to talk to you about it then. I'll let Ilana do her own introduction. Thanks, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Emily. I'm gonna share. All right, we're all good. We see it. Yeah, thumbs up. Cool. All right. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to From Goodbye to Green Burial, talking to children about death. I'm Ilana Haimes. I'll start with a little bit of background on myself, and then I'll jump into this evening's topic. All right. I spent 11 years as a part-time Jewish educator. So my professional and academic background is in a few environmental fields and design. And tonight I'm going to be talking from the perspective of my experience in one of the synagogues where I worked as an educator. I taught a life cycle curriculum, and one of the most interesting and challenging parts of that curriculum was the unit on death, burial, and mourning. So I want to preface this whole webinar with the caveat that I'm not a trained professional educator, right? This is a passion and a part-time job. I want to be transparent that this is an experiential. But I really hope that you're able to get some things out of this to use in your own classrooms or your own educational environments. Discussing death, burial, and mourning can be done in so many ways. So maybe this will tie in with some of your current best practices, but really there's no one way, there's no one right way to tackle this topic. So let's get into it. I'm a process person. So tonight you're going to get a sense of that throughout this presentation. Our process tonight will start with the introduction that I just gave of who I am, where I fit in. And then we're going to talk about laying a foundation in the classroom, the perspectives we can use from which to introduce this topic to children. We'll discuss using process and method as a kind of handrail or a guidepost for teaching about death, burial, and mourning. We'll explore using text as another guidepost, whether it's text created in the classroom or text brought in from other spaces. And then I'll touch on my feelings about age-appropriate programming, and we'll finish up with the topic I think most of you are the most familiar with, which is green burial, and how we can pull that into this conversation, both as like an educational tool, a way of educating people about death and burial, and a way to kind of uh, put a comforting blanket over everything at the end. Great. Um, I'm just gonna pause. Is the screen share working right? I know Danielle just put that it's not.
Ilana, I see your screen, although I'm on the agenda slide.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So multiple people can see it. Danielle, I hope you can see it soon.
Danielle, we'll
Uh,
let you back in if you have to restart Zoom or something like that.
cool. All right. So into the basics. There are three ways that I like to set a foundation for any topic I'm educating on, regardless of how easy or difficult the subject is to talk about. I think it's really important for something that can be so hard, like life cycle subjects, particularly those that we don't get to experience ourselves as we're learning about them, or that we don't celebrate or talk about frequently. Um, so to lay the foundation, I like to first check perspectives, define terms, and then leave space for questions. So we're going to dig deeper on each of those. So checking perspectives. Um, Inevitably, either during teaching this unit or right before teaching it, a student in my class would experience the death of a family member. Uh, without fail every year, unfortunately. But so we had to approach the topic carefully, right? Because I was teaching mostly sixth and seventh graders. And at that age, there were plenty of children who had not yet experienced loss in their lives. And then there were those who had. So for those who had experienced, there was a difference too between the closeness of a recent experience, versus a more distant experience from maybe a few years prior, which in the life of an 11 or a 12-year-old is a significant portion of time removed, and puts that person at a totally different stage of development. So to manage these different perspectives, I like to create a safe space in the classroom. Of course, at the beginning of the year, the way most classrooms, I think, do, we create a contract. I like to readdress that contract at this point, remind them continuously that this is a safe space, both so that they are creating a safe space for each other and that they feel comfortable sharing, and that they need to take their peer sharing seriously. Um, After reminding them a few times, or maybe even more than a few times, about the need for respect and all of that, I'll ask them if any of them have recently experienced a loss and would like to share, or if they've seen their parents or someone else experience a loss. Even if they're slightly removed from it, there's still an understanding that this event may have occurred in their lifetime. There's this unique situation when a student realizes or thinks that they haven't yet experienced the loss of a family member or a family member's loss of a loved one. There's this balance between celebrating the simple joy of not experiencing loss, but also addressing how that can make a student feel left out in a really uncomfortable way, right? You don't want to feel left out because you don't know somebody who's passed away or somebody who's died. It depends on the proportion of experiences in the classroom, but I've found that even though nobody wants to say they feel left out for not having experienced loss, if most of the class has been there and somehow there's one person who hasn't, they're going to look for that connection. So in those cases, we can talk about loss in other ways, losing a pet, even knowing someone who's lost a pet. Fortunately or unfortunately, based on the life cycles of animals, it's a more frequent experience at a young age. And starting there lays the groundwork. So everybody in the classroom knows each other's starting points, which it allows them to do their best to respond respectfully to each other, knowing each other's experiences throughout the rest of the unit. And then no matter the perspective of the student, we can all grow and learn through self-reflection, reflection on how we act as a caregiver or how we're modeling for our future selves, and others, the process of grief. So the next layer in the foundation, we'll say, is defining terms. As this goes on, you will see that I don't think there's much of a difference between what we should teach children and what we should teach any other people of any other age. It's really a matter of the words that we use. I'm an advocate for plain language, not euphemisms. And depending on the age group, kids can be very literal. So I want to make sure that they understand exactly what I'm talking about. Saying passed away versus saying died to someone who, understands idioms and metaphors is really different than saying it to someone who doesn't. I think you can also run into that same type of confusion if you have non-native speakers in your classroom. Euphemisms don't always translate or they don't get learned in the same way. And with serious topics like death, it's important that we don't create any additional hurdles to forming and understanding. We want everyone to start from the same point. So, along with plain language, it's important to keep terminology consistent. So, in my case, when I was talking about the process of Jewish burial and mourning, we have this 30-day period of time for a mourner called Shloshim. So, I will always explicitly say Shloshim or the 30 days together. So, it's up to the students if they want to use one or both phrases together when responding in discussion. But I want to be consistent in providing the same framework so that they're learning the core of the topic rather than getting tripped up on shifting jargon. An activity that I really like to do is to create a glossary or a dictionary. Um, Within this unit, I always had my students create a book called the Class Guide to Death, Burial, and Mourning, where they would create a book. We would bind it in class, and the goal was to teach a potential reader about the process. But obviously, they're learning it themselves as they create the book. I found that it was much easier to get them to create a glossary for other people than for themselves. So it's a really useful activity to ensure that everybody knows the words being used. It gives them a place to reference back to. And it provides a preview of what we're going to be learning. For a difficult topic, I find it's helpful to give a little bit of insight into what the future brings to make it a little bit less nerve-wracking or frightening even for some students. So for example, if we define unveiling as you're seeing an example of student work here, they know what unveiling does and does not pertain to. And they also know that at some point we're going to talk about going back to the grave after the death of a loved one and what sort of emotions that might bring up. The last part of setting the foundation for me in the classroom is to leave space for questions. Uh, I think something that we've become more uncomfortable with is silence, but it's so vital to take the time to pause and really give them a chance to think about their questions. Um, so this gives students a space to breathe, to react naturally to the topic, whether that means like level setting within themselves by saying something silly to like release stress, or by being really sincere or serious or sad. Um, Giving them a break to think. And then as long as the question that comes out of it comes from a place of respect, and that can be different for different people or different age groups or what have you. But allowing the classroom to go silent for a moment and then leaving space is incredibly important. Um, if you're teaching virtually, this is really hard. Silence in a Zoom classroom is uncomfortable, like beyond silence in person, but in person I found it's a little bit easier. Um, so if you have tips for dealing with silence in a Zoom classroom and making it comfortable, throw them in the chat. I'll help some folks out here. Um, okay. So now that we've laid our, ooh, sorry about that. I'm giving you guys a preview. Now that we've laid our groundwork, I want to move on to how I approach the topics, discussing the topics of death, burial, and mourning. So knowing where students stand, whether they've shared publicly when we were laying our foundation, or maybe I have inside knowledge from the school principal or a parent pulling me aside before class. We can address the topics. We can come up with our approach. Um, Either as a whole class or we can approach it differently based on which different students, depending on their levels of maturity, experience, their ability to cope with the topic. I've had students that just get really upset when we're talking about death because they become very emotional. They think about people close to them. And so we have to, this is not exposure therapy, right? This is a classroom. Um, and so I want to make sure that students they're on the edge of discomfort, but they're not uncomfortable with the way that we're learning. So there are three ways that I tend to approach teaching about death, burial, or specifically mourning, but death, burial, and mourning. They're all based in this idea of what it means to be the living. It sounds really simple, but it's much more tangible to approach death from the perspective of what it means to be the surviving people, and very clearly stating that lens, because it is really the only perspective that we have. So the first approach is, I am a mourner, and this is how I'm going to process a death. So the first person approach. If a student isn't ready for that, I move on to the second approach. I know a mourner, and I'd like to help them process a death. And that's not to say that I only choose one approach throughout the unit, but it helps to give a relative starting point. The third approach removes people entirely. If that's too difficult, or if a student is having trouble connecting or having too much discomfort in connecting, and it says, a pet died and I want to remember that pet, or my friend's pet died and I want to help them remember that pet. We're giving kind of stepping stones to closeness. So I'm going to give you some examples of student work that's come from these three perspectives, regarding so finding comfort as a mourner. One student came up with this list for the guide that we created, detailing what can be done to honor the dead. So their list includes um, telling stories, saying the Mourner's Kaddish, which is a Jewish prayer for mourners, leaving rocks on the grave according to Jewish custom. Remember, I was a Jewish educator, so all of these things have their base in Jewish education, but it could be leaving flowers if that was your custom, naming someone after a deceased person, making a physical item or a piece of writing to remember them, or simply working with their memories. Um, that same student, I really liked their process here, wrote about what can be done to respect a mourner. So we can move into the third person action. Um, how to comfort and respect the mourner. So their ideas span the spectrum from helping take care of them and easing their burden to generally just interacting with them like a quote unquote normal person, if they're ready for that, or bringing them to a trained professional to help with the mourning process. This student really showed an understanding that they may not have the entire capacity to handle the needs of a mourner themselves. Um, so the third perspective, so moving on to the perspective of removed from human to human loss, we can look at mourning the loss of a pet. I've had students write a prayer or a poem for someone mourning a pet, draw a picture depending on their age and skill levels and preferences. So one example comes from a student who wasn't quite ready to consider what it might feel like to lose a person in their life. You can see it a little bit in the way this is written. They're trying to be serious and respectful, but it's maybe a little bit less emotionally refined in the way they've added this PS at the end. It brings me back to the fact that these are young people. They haven't experienced a ton of death in their lives, which is great, right? But they're just starting to learn how they might process those feelings. So they go from really thinking about maybe the it's not the right way to process them necessarily, but the we'll say like socially acceptable way to really expressing their frustration and their anger that they haven't figured out how to put into um, more poetic words yet. So, speaking of process, I think it's important to use process as a guide for any difficult subject. So, if you're thinking about how we learn new things, we learn through steps and processes. In learning to read, we build blocks by sounding words out and then forming them and getting to context and meaning. In math, we learn the order of operations and history. We learn a timeline, so on and so on. So we learn that there's a process and an order to everything that we do in life. And it's helpful to let people know that death is no different. Just because it feels like the end of something and it might be scary or uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that there aren't digestible steps and even norms involved. So teaching this unit, I used three general paths of approach. So the personal, the cultural, and the religious. My students and we came at it mostly from a religious perspective. So we looked at the customs in Judaism, um, from the stage of pronouncing someone dead, to burying them to coming out of mourning a year later. However, the two other underlying processes still apply, right? The personal and the cultural. We can look at cultural aspects, which don't have to be strictly religious, and they can be community based. For instance, in your community, are there specific funeral homes or cemeteries or burial types that tend to be used? Is there a community system like a dinner sign up to ease the burden of a person in mourning? Or we can point to the evolution of cultural norms, like adding a virtual memorial or a virtual funeral ceremony for people who can't travel to attend. Um, and then there's the personal process, and this is where we can introduce stages of grief. So this is still examined from the what I've been calling the perspective of the living, because that's how we encounter death. You only experience death once as the person dying, but unfortunately, you encounter it myriad times as a living person. So we can look at the personal process that you or someone else might go through, while caveating the whole thing that with the reminder that this is a really individual experience. I can teach you what the customs are, or what the typical emotional ride you might go on might look like, but I can't teach you how you or other people your age or not your age are going to feel. So I like to provide a framework and different types of frameworks to help guide them through it. Uh, okay. The other underlying approach I use when teaching about death, burial, and mourning is to use text as a guide. Um, Actually, I use text as a guide no matter what I'm teaching about. I love a, a text study. Um, but my definition of text in these cases is super broad. Pretty much anything can be a text if it's written down. Music, excerpts from a book, essays, blog posts, religious passages. We can also create our own texts. A lot of my educational style involves responding to a feeling or idea through writing a poem or making a drawing. A drawing can be a text. We can work to decipher and comment on it in the same way that we do any standard piece of literature. Um, so coming up with a response and committing it to paper can be useful for the students to do themselves, just as useful, if not more so, for someone trying to understand their feelings and the reality of what's happening as pulling from existing texts that are out there in the world already. I like to I like to give opportunities for students to study each other's texts to see what their contemporaries are saying and feeling. We can write commentaries on each other's work, respectful commentaries on each other's work. So for those of you who are familiar with Jewish liturgy, I've had students create a piece of writing and then essentially create a page of Talmud around it, um, which is a piece of writing with commentary surrounding the center of it. Um, One student writes a response to a feeling, a concept, or a process, or some kind of like statement of fact. And then other students surround that writing with comments and discussions, responding to both the initial text and whatever else they've learned. It's a discussion on a page. It would go into our guide. Um, and that was always a really it was really interesting to see how students started to respond to each other, and then to respond to the responses and so on. I'll give you a quick example, which would be using the concept of unveiling that we defined earlier, where that headstone of the deceased is unveiled after 11 months. We can use that definition as our central text and respond to it. Or I might ask, what are the words you would say if you had a speaking role at an unveiling? And then we can discuss those words in context, exploring how they might make someone feel, whether they are the mourner or a friend of the mourner or another relation. So there's a lot of text on this slide. Sorry. But to feed into the next section, where I'm going to talk about what's age appropriate, some texts we've used in the classroom include this essay by Abraham Joshua Heschel about using death as a way to understand life and vice versa. Um, Essays like this are a great way, if you are a religious educator, to bridge the religious with the secular, giving students an insight into how religious studies can inform everyday life, if that's the vibe you're going for. I also use religious excerpts that students might already be familiar with from attending regular prayer services, like Psalm 23. So this gives them an opportunity to think differently about something that might seem ordinary or routine. Um, Really diving into, like, I hear this all of the time. What is it actually talking about? And bringing some regularity to speaking about death in their lives, right? It gives them an opportunity to think differently. They hear things like Psalm 23 referenced in shul, and in pop culture, and we can look at it and we can think about how um, it differently and more specifically in relation to death or dying. It's important to acknowledge that there's different perspectives within writings themselves, right? They're not all just about death. For instance, Psalm 23 is about death, but Psalm 121 is written for specifically for people who are in mourning. There's an understanding that we can talk about death without being in active mourning ourselves. We can discuss it without feeling the immediate sadness of a personal loss. It remains continually an important conversation to have. All right, we're gonna try this. I don't know if it's gonna work because of the webinar format, but we're going to try a quick text study. We're going to use this well-known song based on a passage from Ecclesiastes. I loved using this song in the classroom. Sixth and seventh graders are not always hip to classic folk music, so I was playing the song for them. Seeing the reactions um, was like a hidden bit of fun for me within this serious topic. So I want you all to take a couple of minutes, look at this text, consider your reflections. How does this song make you feel? How can a song like this be used to comfort people experience life cycle transitions if you think that it can be used as a comfort? Um, and then we can also look at it from the perspective of, for students who aren't ready to articulate their immediate personal feelings, we can take a more tangible route. So death is part of a greater whole. This song is about the complete picture of life and like everything it entails. So we can look at actions on the song and find real life examples. When is the time to be born, or a time to plant, or a time to heal? Um, and discuss what's easier to come up with examples for what seems to be like a positive action or a negative action, and what does it mean to categorize an action as positive or negative. So I'm going to try this. I'll give you, we'll say 2 minutes to consider the text, and then maybe we can share some reactions in the chat, um, and talk through them. So 7:34, I'm gonna unmute again and we'll start sharing. Okay. Um, this is my time to also make peace with silence, right? Um, so Emily, thank you for adding into the chat. I think if other folks are willing to share, I'd love to see some of your takeaways from how this might be useful in teaching about life cycle transitions, or I mean specifically in this case death and burial and mourning. But I think I'm on board with Emily's interpretation. That's usually my closing takeaway when we study this piece is, death is part of a greater series of events, right? Um, we can we can discuss that, but we also get to discuss birth and other major events in our lifetimes. Awesome. All right, we're getting some more brave souls here. I love it. Um, I think one of the challenges of this song too is, um, that we're ascribing a time to everything, right? It's really hard to tell kids that there's a time for people to die. It's really hard to tell adults that too, right? So we can take a lot of time on those kinds of lines, especially for those younger students who have experienced a loss in their lifetime. Um, hearing things like "it was time" or "there's a time for everything," really digging into how that affects their feelings, um, and showing them that those feelings exist both within them and in, the greater popular culture can be helpful. Although popular culture might be a stretch. I'm so happy that, let's see, Jill and Ben and Crystal are sharing in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna move on, but keep sharing. I'll read through them. Um, okay, so I want to bring this all together and um, be really wary of oversimplifying or being reductive about how children learn. Um, I intentionally bring dense, difficult texts into the classroom. Um, I like to use 3 steps to make them approachable. Um, so take this excerpt from the Abraham Joshua Heschel text that I had more fleshed out on a previous slide as an example. So the fact of dying must be a major factor in our understanding of living. Yet only a few of us have come face to face with death as a problem or a challenge. There's a slowness, a delay, a neglect on our part to think about it, for the subject is not exciting, but rather strange and shocking. This is a small and context-free snippet, but I'm just going to use it as an example here, so bear with me. So to make this approachable, the first step is to ensure that all of the language is understood. Just because we know what certain words mean generally does not mean that we know what they mean in context, right? So I'll ask the students, this goes back to my glossary dictionary bend, right? What do words like delay or neglect or even shocking mean in this setting? We can look at their definitions, we can discuss them, we can create a culture where they feel comfortable asking what words mean. And once we've established that it's okay to ask what these words mean and to define them as a group, um, we can ask if there are other terms need to clarify. If a student notes that they don't understand necessarily what strange means in the situation, we'll simply add it to our list. Um, the next step, the second step, is to break it down. So as a solid block, a text like this can be really intimidating, but each sentence or group of sentences can be reworded into a way of speaking that's more familiar to the age group. Breaking it down can also mean breaking it down physically, like just hitting the enter key before you print something out. A few times, like actually putting space between the words. Um, but we can take it, sentence by sentence. For example, sentence 1 becomes understanding death can help us understand life better. We're not pulling it apart just yet. We're simplifying the language. That is, we'll ask how and why later, but not yet. So sentence 2 becomes, not everyone thinks about death. And then sentences 3 and 4, I would combine them, but I don't think they make much sense on their own. A lot of people just don't think about death until they have to because it's really hard. So the third step, once we understand the simplified sentences, is to put it back together and create some real world examples. So for the concept that understanding death helps us understand life better, we can talk about how we have to learn how to approach difficult subjects, just like we learn any other thing in life. Um, I used to help my students with math homework before class started, so I always used math examples to, tie it all in. So like you don't know how to do long division until you learn it, and you may not know how to think about death until you learn more about it. Um, the now that like with these 3 steps, now the core meaning is established, the students can move forward and comment on it. The reflections that you receive back will in my experience, naturally be age appropriate to them because they're responding within their own capacity and they've created um, a version of the text that is, at their level. So I think it's important to not worry about content being overcomplicated and to avoid reducing the quality of the material by like reducing the age of the material. We have these clear pathways we can use to make difficult content accessible, especially for life cycle events, which are inherently, to me, age appropriate simply because they continue to happen around you, no matter what age you are. Um, so I will more or less start to wrap things up. I like to wrap things up on a positive note, and talking about green burial. So I always tried to teach this unit in the spring. In part, this was because I was teaching in Wisconsin, and teaching something that can be construed as gloomy in the dead of winter was really rough. It's hard to be cold and sad at the same time. Um, but it was also because when we finished the unit, I like to take students on a field trip to a local cemetery. There's this beautiful rural style cemetery in Madison, Wisconsin. It dates back to the Civil War era, and it had these like really wonderful historic elements and design features. And it helped the students to understand while we had been talking and responding to death and being in a state of sadness or mourning. Um, sorry. Um, a cemetery where we visualize death the most has this capacity to be a special and almost warm place that can bring a sense of calm and peace. Um, Using cemeteries that have alternative functions, and I probably am a little bit preaching to the choir here, like garden cemeteries or conservation cemeteries or, places certified through Green Burial Council. Can make a wonderful field trip. We can talk about how we feel when we get to go outside on a nice day and look at the intentional design of the landscape, discuss what design should make us feel. If you remember from my intro slide, I have a design background, so that's one bend. And then another way to talk about green burial is through storytelling. What is the story of green burial that a child can connect with? We can talk about death feeding into life, showing that the cycle of life doesn't just stop at the end, but it circles back around. The idea of decomposition being a natural process that allows for new growth, or creating a protected landscape that fosters beautiful gardens, birds, wildlife, can be a highly reassuring thought. It allows children to see that something positive can come from the end of this process. It shows them that we can create spaces surrounding death that aren't intended to keep you stuck in that saddened state. We talk about mourning with death and burial and mourning with such sadness, but there's a profound way to use the design and the schema of a natural cemetery as a method of reassurance. Um, and I like to close on that. Um, we go through it methodically, and we talk about death and then burial and then mourning, but I think burial can actually be one of the most comforting parts of the whole process to discuss. So with that, we have about 15 minutes left, which is a good amount of time for questions or other discussions. So I'm going to end, and I want to thank you all for listening, for coming tonight, and for hearing me share my experiences of teaching this curriculum. It was a really interesting thing to be a little bit thrown into, a little bit prepared for when I started one of my many teaching jobs, but it very quickly became my favorite unit to teach for a lot of reasons. So we have a few minutes left. You can ask questions, whether they're for me or broader questions, I think, for the GBC. So thank you.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Happy to answer questions not on this topic as well. And if any of you are typing it into the chat is not accessible, it would be fine to come off mute and speak up and ask your question as well. Ilana, I do have a question for you. Put you on the spot here, or maybe not. Okay, from your perspective in Judaism, or your perspective as an educator, what's your opinion on if children should be involved in funerals?
That is I think I'm trying to come up with my answer and answer this on the spot at the same time. I think my perspective is definitely similar to whether or not children should be involved in funerals that it is to the whole process, right? It's are they on the edge of discomfort? Like I I would be wary of pushing someone to an extreme level of discomfort. Um, so to the extent that involvement puts them on the edge of their comfort zone, yes, like I don't expect any child to be comfortable being involved in a funeral, but um, as a professional or a parent or a caregiver, you might be able to meter like what is the right level there
Yeah.
for either involvement or no involvement or depth of involvement.
That's a good point. I do think it's probably unique to the child and to the family. Ilana, if you could stop sharing your screen, I have something I want to show just for a moment, and then we'll take Neil's suggestion and leave it with no share on so we can see each other. So those of you I haven't met, I operate a natural burial ground, Colorado Burial Preserve. And this is just my like slide deck that I use when I'm introducing natural burial, but also the project of Colorado Burial Preserve to folks. And oh, I just have this anecdote. This is a little video I wanted to share. This is related to kind of my feelings about nature and green burial. But anyway, this little family, it was grandfather who was buried, and the grown-ups at this funeral, like everyone did a symbolic amount of shoveling for the green burial. And then the kids were not ready to stop. And all of the grown-ups at this funeral were kind of like looking at their clock because, we had brunch somewhere planned. And meanwhile, the kids were doing this physical, embodiment of the rituals of green burial. And, they seem to me to have this innate understanding of, what we were doing out there. And, yeah, for me, I think that's part of this a special nature of kids. They are less removed from nature than those of us who have been fully socialized into adulthood. So for me, I see people's closeness or separateness from nature, because of course we are nature. Don't ever forget. It's so easy to forget when we're driving cars and living in cities. But anyway, the more we lose sight of our essential naturalness, also we have this industrial set of options for care after death with the modern cemetery and cremation industries. So anyway, I love natural burial. Sorry, nature as a keystone for bringing up kind of themes of death and dying. Of course, my work is primarily with adults. Yeah, I find that like, oh, we find it when we study the seasons. Things fall in the fall and they fertilize the ground. We see it with kids when we learn about a life cycle of a butterfly, and study metamorphosis, and then all of a sudden these topics of both death and renewal are right there next to topics we're already comfortable with. Crystal's asking, does the GBC have any resources for youth? Specifically, kind of what I'm saying is this natural process of transitioning back to the earth. Crystal, that's a great question. Firstly, I think, especially through the kind of lens that Ilana gave us tonight, a lot of our basic info about green burial could be used in a for kids setting, especially if we make a glossary of the big words and break it down sentence by sentence. But I actually think that's a really good idea, is that we could have specific youth resources. We've also talked about translating our resources into other languages just to be more accessible, etc. So yeah, that's a good takeaway from this topic for us to take a look at.
Crystal had also put in another plug for a field trip. Um, experiencing positivity in a cemetery, going for a walk, looking at the beauty. All the photos that were in tonight's webinar were photos that I've just taken because I like to walk through cemeteries, as I'm sure many of you do, and seeing the amount of life that's there, um, and color. Like there's a wild amount of color in a good cemetery.
I've always thought that's really one of the arguments for a natural burial ground, especially when it comes to the death positivity movement, death educators. In at the burial ground here in Colorado, we have a habitat restoration project, including bird boxes for nest boxes for bluebirds. And so I've always said, like, okay, we're going to get people here because they're excited with something cute, baby birds, and then kind of just allow them to be exposed to death and dying as a side effect of being out in nature and learning about our ecosystem, but that we can be comforted by the adjacent topics of life and blooming and beauty, even as we face the challenging ones. Jill says Greenwood, famous cemetery in New York City, has beehives, so that's another good example of something sweet and summery and fun. I see Neil has his hand raised if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm on the East Coast. I just noticed in New York City. I'm a member of a New York City congregation. So I'm curious, and maybe there's another way I can really try to connect with local folks. I live in Connecticut, so we're trying to sort of juggle what we're doing, personally related to green burial, but I'm also interested in children's education, so both in a Jewish context and an overall context. So I'm just curious, maybe I should just reach out to you post and see how I could connect.
Yeah, certainly there are good resources of folks from New York, New England, Eastern Seaboard. So I would think we can network connect you to the right person. I'll put the email in the chat. Green Burial Council has a full-time office administrator. So this email, that info@greenburialcouncil.org, that is the best way to send a general inquiry to the GBC, and we'll be sure to divert you to the right portion of the organization. And I'm also going to put my own email in the chat as well. Just repeating the thank you to everyone that joined us tonight. Such a good topic. I think it's one that has not often talked on and necessary because someone died. How do I talk to a kid? It's a big question. So having a little bit of process in our toolkits for things to think about is kind of like a different kind of first aid of the psyche. When we're called to it, we'll know what the first few steps are. So unless anyone has any other questions for Ilana, kind of speak now or hold your peace or email the GBC and we'll get them forwarded. But Ilana, I definitely wanted to thank you for bringing this to us tonight. The fact that you've worked in this topic is so unique and interesting. So I was super, super glad to learn about it.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.